You know, we often will say, oh, what a coincidence. Like, we love when God does the miraculous, right? We know, oh, that's a miracle, and we love that. Do you know the difference between a miracle and a coincidence? I was just thinking about this this morning, actually. A miracle is when God puts himself on display. A coincidence is when God just is working behind the scenes. But he's always working. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for sharing part of your weekend with us. By the way, if this is your first time here, we certainly want to extend to you a very warm welcome and say thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. You know, it can be a little nerve-wracking going to a place for the very first time. You don't know the people. You don't know what they do. You don't know what they believe. I mean, I certainly have got intimidated many times walking to a new place. So we just thought to make it easy for you, we thought we'd share some inside information. And that is, we have a mission. And we try very hard to stay focused on keeping the main thing the main thing. And the main thing around here that we do is we seek God, we serve others, and we share Jesus Christ. That's the main thing that we do around here. We really believe it. We try to live that out day after day. Now, we believe a relationship, obviously, with Jesus is a game changer. And we love the town of Tillsonburg, not because of the beautiful farmlands, not because of the awesome people that live here, but because we believe God has strategically placed us right here in Tillsonburg for such a time as this, that we can have the opportunity to share the great love of God. In fact, there's been many people right here that know the transforming power of Jesus Christ in their own lives because their lives have been transformed. And so we just think there's no greater joy than sharing the love of Jesus. And we love doing it together because we think we weren't designed to live in isolation. We're designed really to do life together. And it's always better, obviously, when you do it together. And let me also give a shout out to those who are joining us online, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or the Rogers Network. We're glad to have you here this morning. Well, 4 weeks ago, we began this new series called Keep Calm. And you may say, Donald, it's crazy, you can't keep calm. The world's falling apart. No, keep calm. Donald, how can you say that we have a political divide in our country? What do you mean, say keep calm? No, keep calm. Donald, you don't understand. My kids have gone off the rails. How do I keep calm? I say keep calm because it's the second part. Because God is at work. Because God is working. We are studying one of the strangest books in the Bible. I say strange because there is no mention of God in any of the pages that we're studying. The book of Esther. 10 chapters, 167 verses, and not one mention of God. Now, I think if you went out on the street and you asked the average person walking down the street, do you think there's a book in the Bible that doesn't mention God? They'd all say, no. Of course there's no book in the Bible that wouldn't mention God. Because the Bible's where you go to learn about God. That's where you're supposed to find out what God is like. Why would there be a book in the Bible that doesn't even mention his name? Some people would even say, maybe it's a mistake that it's part of the Bible. Well, over the past 4 weeks, I think we're discovering just because God's name is not in this book of Esther does not mean his handprints are all over the pages. His fingerprints, his thumbprints are through the entire book. Just because his name's not there does not mean he is not there, because there is no place that God cannot be found. And I know that you and I have many times have wondered, where is God when we look at our circumstances, when we look at our situations? Sometimes we feel like he's left us to defend ourselves. Maybe he's gone for a long walk and he's forgotten about us. We might even think he loves us, but he just doesn't care about our everyday situations that we find ourselves. And so we begin to convince ourselves, because we can't see him or feel him or hear him or sense his presence, well, then he's nowhere to be found. But one of the things that we discovered last week is that God is just as purposeful when we cannot see him as when he does reveal himself. Now, we love when he reveals himself, because then we know, yeah, okay, that's God. But let me tell you, God is just as purposeful even when you cannot see him. As we're making our way through the book of Esther, we're getting these glimpses that God is always present. He may actually be over there in the shadows. He may not be on the main stage. He may be just working behind the stage, but he's always there. There's nothing happening that he is not aware of. You see, because he's always at work. It's just that sometimes he's working behind the scenes of our life. And by the way, God is always at work, I love this part, for your good. For your good and his glory. It's just that sometimes he's just not always on the front stage, on the main stage. He's just behind the scenes. Now, as I said earlier, this time period that we're studying is just so different than the time period that we're living today. I mean, it's a time when one man's decision affected the entire world. So it would, we can't imagine living in Canada that there would be somebody that could make a decision that would impact, Germany and France and Spain and England and Canada, the U.S. and South America and the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia. But this particular period of time, one man's decision does impact the entire known world, and that's King Xerxes. So let's do a quick recap, okay? Chapter 1, we find that there's trouble in the kingdom. The king's marriage is a mess. There's tension. And then there's all this drama that's happening. In fact, it's over-the-top drama. Then in chapter 2, we get the first episode of The Bachelor. Remember, Esther finally receives the final rose, and she becomes the queen of Persia. And when we read that chapter 2, we cannot believe that a Jewish orphan girl living in exile becomes the most powerful and influential woman in the entire world. Then in chapter 3, of course, that's when things get a little bit interesting, because we are introduced to the villain of the story, Haman. And Haman is described as an enemy of the Jews. And he puts this great elaborate plan together that he's going to wipe out all the Jews in the empire. He goes to the king, he gets the king's approval. He just says, there's a group of people that don't obey you, king. King doesn't ask any questions. And the law is put in place. And what we discovered, when a law is put in place with the Medes and Persians, you could not change it. The king himself could not change his own law. Once it was done, it was a done deal. What I said last week is that God develops us most times in the middle of a crisis. I don't like this, by the way. I'd rather him develop me when things are going good. But God develops us and shapes us and molds us when things are tough. I think sometimes when life is so good, we just go along through life. Then when some tough times come, we're like, oh, I need to bring this to God. Well, God, where are you? What are you doing? And so I think it does bring our focus back to him. And I think that's true. Most times he's developing us in the middle of a crisis. Chapter 4, we learned who Esther was and the fact that she was a Jew, even though nobody knew that she was a Jew, because her cousin Mordecai had told her, keep it a secret. And this law has been passed, and she is unaware of it. She's kind of sheltered. She's living behind the palace walls, yet the whole city is in an uproar, and she doesn't know about it. And then she discovers that her cousin Mordecai is out in sackcloth and ashes, and she sends one of her employees out there to find out or actually sends an employee out there with a brand new outfit for him to change his clothes, and he refuses them, and the employee comes back and says, Queen, Esther, he won't take them. Well, she's confused as to why he wouldn't take the new clothes, so she sends out another employee. Employee goes out and finds out the whole story. Mordecai explains the whole story, what has happened. He tells Esther, you have got to go before your king, before your husband, and make the request. because she's getting all the details. He says, you got to go now. You got to go talk to your husband now. Now, the thing is, what we discovered is Esther is facing two crises in her life. She's facing a personal crisis and a corporate crisis. The personal crisis, she says, I have not seen my husband in 30 days. We live under the same roof, but we have actually not interacted for the last 30 days. Personal crisis. Corporate is she knows that her people are going to soon experience genocide if something doesn't happen. One of the things we said, of course, last week in our review is just that crises often change our direction in life. We thought we were going this way. It all looked good until something happened, and then God redirects our path, and we find ourselves going in a completely different direction. And so Mordecai, the queen, Esther's cousin, says, you've got to go before the king and beg. You got to beg for mercy for the Jewish race, because the Persian law has been passed. And on one certain day, the 13th day of the 12th month, anybody could kill a Jew and then take all of their belongings. That was the law that had been passed. Now the thing is, Esther is scared to death to go before the king, which seems so odd to us because it's her own husband. Why would it be so tough to go and talk to your own husband for a little bit of mercy? Why would she be so nervous about that? Well, in the Persian culture, as we looked at, nobody actually goes before the king without being summoned. Not even your wife. Nobody, unless he calls you. Yes, they're living under the same roof, but they haven't seen each other for 30 days. And so she's having her own personal crisis. She knows her husband has hundreds of women in the harem. So obviously, if he's not spending the nights with her, she knows what he's doing at night. And if Esther goes before the king without being summoned, and basically she's putting her life on the line, she's basically writing her death sentence. That's what she's doing by just walking in without being asked. And then Mordecai says, but who knows, Esther? Maybe God has put you in this place for such a time as this. Maybe God has made you the queen of Persia for now, for a time like this. You know, Esther's conclusion is 30 days ago it would have been good because I was with the king 30 days ago. This is not good timing. But one of the things that we discovered last week is that God's time is always prime time. I brought this clock to represent time. We live by the clock, do we not? We go to work at 8, we get off at 4:30, 5 o'clock, we rush home, we have supper, we have lunch at 12, we got to take a kid to the soccer practice at 6:30, then we got to be back to take that person to a baseball practice, and then it's 10 o'clock, you got to go to bed, you got to make lunches for school, you got to get back up at 7 o'clock. Like, we live by the clock. We come to church, it's 10:30, I like to get there early, I'll be there at 10:15. I hope that guy doesn't speak long because I have a roast in the oven, he's going to burn the roast. Like, we live by the clock. And so we think God has to work within our time. That's just the truth. We think he has to work according to our time. The thing is, God's time is always prime time. God is never late, and he's never early. He's always just on time, because his time is prime time. Now, I don't know what's going through Esther's mind. I don't know if she's thinking she's lost favor, with the king, because she knows what's happened in chapter 1. We know what happened to his first wife, Vashti, and she was a 12 out of a 10, like she was a knockout, yet she was easily replaced. I don't know if she's thinking, I haven't seen the king for 30 days. Maybe our marriage is rocky. Maybe I'm the next to be kicked out. All I know is that if I go before the king without being summoned, it will be death to me. If I just barge in without an invitation, it's nothing short of a death penalty. So she's asked to go before the king without any invitation and plead her case. And some people would say, or maybe Esther would say, how can you ask me to do something for someone else when I'm in the middle of my own personal crisis? How can I help somebody else? I mean, don't you think, like, in the back of our minds, don't you just think, well, it is his wife. Well, surely he would let her just walk in and ask, like, what really is the big deal? Like, is Esther being kind of a drama queen? Is she, like, over the top with the drama? Is she trying to make a mountain out of a molehill? Like, really, you can't go before your husband? But she's scared. I mean, maybe some of you may know, maybe talking to your spouse, you might get a little nervous. Hey, honey, funny thing happened today. I was backing up the minivan and, well, put a big dent in your brand new car. Hey, maybe you're a little nervous to mention that. Or maybe you come home and you say, honey, you know those golf clubs I was going to buy for $300, you know? Yeah, well, they actually had one for $1,500, and I'm going to get a much better score, so I hope you don't mind. We won't eat this week, but we're going to have a good score when I go out on the course, right? So sometimes you know what it's like to maybe be a little nervous to talk to your spouse about something. Well, in this particular situation, it's really difficult. I had a friend of mine call. His name is Joe. I was best man at his wedding. He calls me one night. He says, Donald, Wendy, that's his wife, Wendy hasn't talked to me in 2 days. Wow. I said, you must have did something big. No, I haven't done anything. I said, Joe, come on. I wasn't born yesterday. I know you and Wendy really well. You've done something. Nope, haven't done a thing. She just won't talk. This went on for 15 minutes. Finally, he says to me, well, I did buy something. I said, oh, what'd you buy? Like a new television, a new computer? Because, well, I bought a new Harley Davidson. And I said, oh, wow. I actually remember being involved in the conversation when Wendy said to you before you got married that she never wanted a motorcycle in the house because she felt it was too dangerous. Yeah, but I know, but it was such a good deal. I thought she'd be happy that I saved so much money. I only spent $10,000. It was regular $15,000. Now, Joe probably wasn't nervous that Wendy would kill him. Well, actually, I don't know if that's even true, actually, now that I think about that. But anyway, this is the situation, right, for Esther. She knows that she goes before the king. It could be her last time before the king. And so Esther's, really, she's terrified. She's terrified. She's afraid. She hasn't been summoned. And I know we all think, what's the big deal? Just go and talk to your husband. But she finally comes to the point, the resolve, if I perish, then I perish. If that's what God has for me, then that's because I'm going to do what is right. Now, let me just give you an idea, okay? Because we think, well, King Xerxes, you know, her husband, like, what kind of a guy was he? So I thought I did a little bit of history on this guy. This is the kind of guy he is, right? You may discover why maybe she was a little nervous to go before her husband. And an inscription was discovered in an archaeological dig about King Xerxes. And the Greek historian Herodotus tells us a little bit about this guy. By the way, he was no bowl of cherries to live with. I know there would be lots of girls in the kingdom like, oh, if I could just be like Esther, life would be so good. But he's no bowl of cherries to live with. An inscription was found where King Xerxes wrote himself. It says, I am Xerxes, the great king, the only king, the king of the entire earth, far and near. Now, the last time I heard a king say something like that, his name was Nebuchadnezzar, and it did not end so well with him. He thinks quite highly of himself. Herodotus also writes that Xerxes was the tallest and the most handsome of all the Persian kings. He was ambitious, he was ruthless, and he was jealous. And proof of that is happened in some of the records of the Greek wars that he found himself in. There was a man named Pythias that went to King Xerxes and said, I want to help you in your war against Greece, and offered him an exorbitant amount of money to help pay for the war. And the king was so moved by that he sent the money back and then sent him presents. But then when Pythias came back to the king and said, I was hoping that you would allow my oldest son to stay home from the war. He took his son, cut him up in pieces, and then had the army march through the pieces. That's the kind of guy he was. When in one of the battles, he had 100,000 men ready to go to battle against the Greeks. And there was a river separating them, and 300 Spartans were able to keep him back. And so it was decided they're going to build 2 bridges. They built 2 bridges actually over the river. Finally, they're going to be able to take his 100,000 men, and the night before they go, a huge storm came, tore down the bridges. And so he had one of the soldiers whip the water 300 times while he had the soldiers shout, cursing the water. He had shackles thrown into the river to show his sovereignty over the water. Even I control the water. Nobody tells me what to do. And then he took the engineers and beheaded them all. This is the kind of guy he was like. One time when he was on his way back home to the citadel of Susa, he tried to seduce his sister-in-law, and because she refused his advances, she had her and her husband, which was his brother, tortured to death. This is the kind of guy. Is it no wonder maybe Esther's a little nervous just to go before the king? because she knows what her husband is like. So all this drama is unfolding. It seems like the world is out of control. But what's so amazing is God is managing every single scene in the story. Last week, it seems like the curtain has fallen. The villain, Haman, has made his move. The enemy of the Jews has made his move. And it seems as though what he has plotted with the king cannot be stopped because it's already in motion. The slaughter of every man or Jewish man, woman, boy, and girl, young or old, will die on the 13th day of the 12th month. And so Esther is ready to put her life on the line. The risk was great, but she's willing to receive the death penalty in order to help try to save the life of her people. She's asked her cousin to ask all the Jewish people in the city to fast and pray for the next 3 days. And now the 3 days are over. It's time to initiate the plan. And we come in chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. When I read that, I go, okay, Esther, you were like so over the top. Come on, you know that husband of yours far better. Look what just happened. What were you so worried about? He's so kind. He welcomes you into his presence. Now you realize what just happened here. Xerxes has just suspended all protocol. Everything that was important, all the stuff that was happening on that particular day is put to a halt as his wife walks in. Now remember, she has said back in chapter 4, if I perish, I perish. Like that's my resolve. If I perish, I perish. I don't think Esther was expecting that kind of reception, because no one just walks into the king's presence unannounced, saying that their agenda is more important than the king's. And yet here the king tilts the scepter to Esther, which is obviously good news for Esther. And she walks forward, and you know every eye is on her. It's deathly silent because this does not happen. You could have heard a pin drop. I think you hear every step she makes down that hallway toward the king. I can't imagine how fast her heart was pounding. Imagine her palms are sweating. I think she's trying to catch her breath. I think it's probably the longest walk she's ever made before as she makes her way to the throne. The king obviously is in a good mood, because look what he says in verse 3. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom. I'm going to give it to you. Half of the kingdom can be yours." He is in a good mood. This is the time for the big ask. That's what you want to do. And as I'm reading through this story, I have to imagine, my imagination is going, thinking, okay, she must have rehearsed this last night. She's gone over and over and over again what she's going to say. And you can't anxiously, what is she going to say to the king? And verse 3 and 5, let's pick it up there again. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." I'm like, really? Lunch date? Like, you got to know people are suspicious. You got to know that everybody in that courtroom is going, Esther's going to put her life on the line for a lunch date? No. Something's up. Something. People don't just walk in for a lunch date, putting their life on the line. I expect everybody is suspicious. I would have expected Haman would have been very suspicious, except he also gets invited. And I think it puts his defenses down. Now, I think when she goes in, it should be like plan A. Plan A's worked. I'm in his presence. Plan B, put it into action. Make the big ask. And she invites him for lunch, an invitation to a banquet. Now, I've heard it said that a way to a man's heart is through his belly. But this is like just over the top. And I think there's a lot of, after she leaves, I think there's a lot of whispering. Like, what was that all about? Like, what just happened? She just came in and just asked to have lunch. I I just can't imagine people's wheels are not turning, because no one in their right mind just walks in, puts her life on the line for a lunch date. Then in verse 5, look what it says. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asked. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom. Oh my goodness, he's in such a great mood today. Like, this is the day you ask. Like, does it get any better than this? Obviously, God has made all the doors open for you to make the big ask. But you know what she says? I don't know if she gets nervous. Maybe she got nervous. Maybe she couldn't form her words. But then he says, well, actually, could you come back tomorrow for another lunch date? I'm like, oh, Esther. Why take the chance that he may not be in a good mood tomorrow? Like, today's the day. And yet, she says, will you come back tomorrow? I'm sure she's nervous. I expect her heart's pounding. Maybe her knees are shaking in that particular situation. Maybe she was ready to do it, but she got scared and held back. I don't know. But I do know that she's asked him to come back the second time. So she's standing in front of the two most powerful men, the king and Haman. One commentator put it this way: it would be like standing before the king and Hitler. So you can imagine. Now, let me tell you, there's a lot that's going to take place in the next 24 hours. I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show. Remember the TV show 24? Jack Bauer, every 24 hours, was somehow diffusing a terrorist attack on the United States. And they come to the end of the show, oh, and there's going to be another one, and your heart's left pounding. Well, let me tell you, there is so much happening in the next 24 hours of this story that your heart is left pounding. Haman is making plans to kill Mordecai the very next day. We find out there's going to be a night of insomnia. And we all know people are not at the best when they're tired. We're going to discover the king couldn't sleep that night. But in all of this, in the next 24 hours, God is working all things out, you know what? In conformity to his will. That's the thing. He's working all those things when it seems like this is, okay, God, you have to work ASAP. There's 24 hours. You only have 24 hours to change it all. And yet he's working everything out in conformity to his will. Mordecai doesn't know there's a hitman that's going to take him out in the next 24 hours. Esther doesn't know that the second dinner she's going to have is going to be too late to save her cousin's life. But God knew. You see, when Haman left that first banquet from the king, he was so puffed up. Like, whoo, look at me. He's walking home. He's strutting. He's swaggering. But then he sees that Mordecai at the king's gate who will not bow to him, and it just eats him away. And so he goes home to his family, tells them all that took place. I was invited, to for dinner with the king and the queen. I was the only one, but that Mordecai. He's going to be the death of me. And so his wife and his friends come up with this plan. Well, hey, why don't you build a gallows? Hang him on it tomorrow morning and build it 75 feet high so everybody knows that Haman has the power of life and death. Sounded like a great plan. And so that night, I'm picturing, it's funny, that song, what's that song? I think it was written by Matt Davis, It's Hard to Be Humble. Oh Lord, it's hard. I think that was his theme song. When Haman is going by, like he can't wait to look in the mirror, right? To know me is to love me. That's his theme song. This is Haman, by the way, full of himself. And so everything goes into action that night. Gallows are being prepared for Mordecai to be impaled the very next day. The king can't sleep. Look at, in fact, verse 1 of chapter 6. That very night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the books of the Chronicles, the records of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. So the king's restless. He's tried every position. He's watched every late TV night show, and he can't get to sleep. Tossing and turning. He finally calls one of his employees in. Just read the records. I mean, it'd be like us having someone read the conversation that took place in Parliament. I mean, it's an instant cure for an insomnia, for sure. And so, but here's what's interesting. Verse 2, it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate the king Xerxes. Of all the records, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records, years of records, the scribe goes and just happens to get the one that puts Mordecai in the good light. Just happens. What a coincidence. So lucky, wasn't it? That would be the scroll that he would choose. And then the king says, in verse 3, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him. His attendant answered, what? A man saves my life and nothing has been done for him? I can't believe that's an oversight. Well, that's got to stop. We got to figure out, what do we do? What do we do for a man who saved the king's life, who the king wants to honor? And we continue reading through the story. We find out, guess who shows up for work early that day? Haman. Of all the days to show up early, he's going to go to the king and talk to him about impaling Mordecai. That's the conversation. And so as he goes in, and Haman walks in, the king says, Haman, what should the king do for a man that he honors? Well, because Haman has just sung the song by Mac Davis, right? Oh, Lord, it's hard to be humble. He immediately thinks the king's talking about him. And I think he's been thinking a long time. I think he's been putting this, when the day comes that the king wants to honor me, what would I want? I don't think his idea came up on the spur of the moment. Because he says, as you read through chapter 6, he says, well, actually, put on him a robe that the king has worn. Not one that's in his closet that he's never worn. No, put a robe on him that the king has worn. And then have him ride a horse that the king has ridden. Not one of his extra horses. No, one that the king has. And then have one of his nobles walk him through the streets, proclaiming, this is what the king does to honor the man who saves his life. Well, of course, you can only imagine when Haman finds out it's Mordecai. He is devastated. The man he had planned to impale in just a few hours, now he's leading him through the city, honoring him. What a quick change of events in less than 24 hours. I mean, you can only imagine the facial expression that must have been on Haman's face. What? What? You can imagine how embarrassed he was, because he's been talking about this for a while to all of his friends. And he's going through the city, letting everybody know, making the announcement. After it's done, he runs back home, has a conversation with his wife and his friends, and they go, oh, this is not good. This is not good. The man that you were supposed to kill today, this is the beginning of the end for you. He thought he had his whole life planned out. This is the beginning of the end, they said, because the one that you wanted to kill now has been lifted up and honored. And at that particular time, when all that's going through his mind, the attendants come and say, hey, it's time for you to go to lunch with the queen. And he's headed back there. I'm sure he thought, I didn't even know the queen even liked me that much, but she obviously really cares for me. I must be great company, because she has invited me for the second time. And so this meal goes on, and of course the conversation happens again. The king, I encourage you to read all of chapter 6, because he comes, he says, okay, Esther, lay it on the line. What do you want? The food's great. I know you wanted something more than just for me to come for lunch. What is it? And so finally, she spits it out. She says, I'm asking you to save my people, my life and my people's life. Like, who would dare take the queen's life? And she goes on to say, if it was just that we were going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't have bothered you with this. But someone is out to rid all of my people and me. Well, you can only imagine. Fury, like he's already a ruthless man. He is angry. It says he just walked out. Because Esther says, it's Haman. It's Haman, the guy that you've elevated through the years, the guy who's climbed the corporate ladder. Right, he's at the top of his game. That guy. And then as the king leaves, we find in the story, he begs Esther for his life. And somehow, I don't know how it worked, but the Bible says he was on top of her when the king came in. And even more furious. And it says they immediately put a hood over his head. And somebody says Haman built a gallows 75 feet high that he was going to kill Mordecai today on. King says, impale him on that. This all happened in 24 hours. So, we have an angry king. We have a banished queen. We have an orphan girl. We have a Jewish employee. We have Haman the narcissist. We have a lunch date. We have an evening construction going on. A night of insomnia. A servant who picks up the right scroll. What a coincidence all these things happen. What a lucky night. Seriously. No. This is not luck. This is not coincidence. This is God at work. Managing every detail, managing every single scene that is happening. You know, we often will say, oh, what a coincidence. Like, we love when God does the miraculous, right? We know, oh, that's a miracle, and we love that. You know the difference between a miracle and a coincidence? I was just thinking about this morning, actually. A miracle is when God puts himself on display. A coincidence is when God just is working behind the scenes. But he's always working. He's always at work. What an incredible chain of events. I'm telling you, only God could do this. Only God. What a picture of God's providence. Have I not said throughout the series, over and over again, God is working it out. God is working it out in conformity to his will, according to Ephesians chapter 1. There's been no mention of God in these pages, and yet it is impossible not to see God at work. I say all of this to remind us this. Even when life seems out of control, God is at work. Those last 24 hours, God is doing so much maneuvering of scenes to make sure it all works out. A sleepless night of a king, a servant who happens just to pick the right scroll. Yeah, even when life seems so out of control, God is at work. Do you know what else? Even when life seems unpredictable, God is at work. What a roller coaster ride it has been for Esther and Mordecai. Up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. I mean, almost need a gravel pill for all the motion sickness that they're going through. Life will be unpredictable, by the way. There'll be times that you're like, what is going on? But I'm telling you, God is at work. Listen, also, even when evil seems to be unstoppable, God is at work. A law put in place to wipe out the Jews. 7-story gallows being built by the enemy of the Jew, a callous dictator. And God's working it out. I love what Psalm 121 verse 4 says. He who keeps Israel will never slumber nor sleep. I like how one commentator puts it this way. Listen to how he puts it. God never goes off duty. So when you have trouble sleeping, he's awake with you. And when you finally drift off to sleep, he doesn't. Because God is never tired. Therefore, you can be. Because God never sleeps, you can. Because you don't have to be in control of situations or circumstances or people, because God already is. God's plans are moving with perfect precision and perfect timing with perfect power. That is living by faith. And we have been called to live by faith. And I'm telling you, it's not always easy. Let's be honest, it's not always easy. Because it's easy to get sucked into just looking at our circumstances, and therefore we look around and we come quickly to the conclusion, God's left me. God's nowhere to be found. But he's at work. So we live by faith even when we can't see him. We live by faith even when we can't feel him. We live by faith even when we feel like we can't hear him. Living by faith. God is at work even when we don't see it or recognize it. And this is the great part. I love this part. God is always at work for your good. We forget that. For your good. Like, you look at it, how can this be good? I don't know how God sometimes takes some of the tragedies of his life and turns it around. Not that it is good, by the way. It doesn't say all things are good, but he's able to make good. And he's doing it for your good and for his glory. And God is working it out in us. He's working it out in us, North Broadway. Listen, God is always working behind the scenes of our life for our good and his glory. Great is his faithfulness. Let's pray. Father, this morning, wow, what an incredible story thus far. There's still more for us to learn as we'll dive back into the book next week. But God, thank you. In this book, this small little book tucked away in the Old Testament, where we're reminded that even when we don't see you, you're there. Because there's no place that you cannot be found. Even when our circumstances seem overwhelming. Even when we want to throw our hands up in the air and give up. God, you're always working. You're always at work. I pray, God, for those who know Jesus today, that would encourage them. I don't know what everyone's going through today, Lord, but you do. I don't know whose marriage is struggling here today. I don't know who's worried about their finances. I don't know who's worried about health. I don't know who's worried about their kids going off the tracks, but you do, God. And so would you whisper into their ears? Would you remind your children they can keep calm because you're at work? When life seems to be pulling us down, God, remind us that we can take all those things that weigh us down, the anxieties, the fear, the stresses of life, and throw it back on you because you care for us. You told us, give it all to me. I'll carry the burden for you. So Lord, may we be encouraged today to know that God has our best interests at heart, and he's working all things out for our good. Now, Lord, it's possible this morning there could be people that don't actually know who Jesus is. And maybe, Lord, you're doing a work in their life this morning. Maybe you're just reminding them that nothing just happens by chance, but there's a God who's orchestrating all things. And Lord, today, for those who may not know Jesus, may they surrender their lives to you. May today be a game changer for them. May they know and experience the life-transforming power of Jesus in their life today. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand as we close this morning?
seas, I knew you would. You reached for me.